Birmingham and go to Matthew. Matthew, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Farage. How you doing?
Hello, fine. So, are you upbeat and optimistic, or do we have reason to be genuinely scared about what's going to happen to the city and the rest of British industry?
Well, our optimism depends on how much we can believe the things that we were told at the time of the referendum. And you said repeatedly during the referendum that it's the unelected commission that is the sole source of EU law. And I was just wondering if you're not whether you were telling the whole story with that.
The whole, sir, the absolute whole truth. The people who make legislation in Europe, those laws are proposed by an unelected bureaucracy and can only, for their genuine amend and improvement in years to come, the source of that is the unelected bureaucracy as well. And what the European Parliament does, we are a revising chamber who can delay things, stop things, hold them up, make the Commission think again. So the sole source of law comes from those we cannot vote and cannot remove. Yes, Matthew.
So you're an MEP, which means that it's your job to amend, as in produce pieces of law that go into the law that's proposed, reject and approve, or simply reject any proposal by the EU, by the Commission.
Any proposal that they give, you amend, means you add law to it, you propose law.
For 18 years, I've never voted for a single piece of new European law. I've abstained many times, but I've generally voted against all of it. I don't think that's the right way to make law. I think that those that make the law should be directly accountable to the electors, and in the European system, they're not.
Given that it's the MEPs, as in people like yourself, who can completely change, completely modify, and completely reject any legislation proposed by the Commission. And even if the Commission was the soul of Lucifer himself, then it wouldn't make a difference, because it's down to you whether or not laws go through, and you can completely alter them. That's your entire job, and yet you're saying that EU legislation is
if the European Parliament wasn't acting against the concept of national interest and for the idea of a European, which I believe to be false interest.
They're directly elected.
And secondly, the European Parliament is as integrationist and as expansionist as the Commission itself. But Matthew, that's not our debate this evening.
Elected.
Our debate this evening is, we voted Brexit. I can tell from your tone that you're not a fan of it. But are you really as pessimistic as the boss of Goldman Sachs would have you believe, that everyone's off to Frankfurt?
We've been having these negotiations and having this public discourse on the idea that the single market is essentially a free trade deal, that we can have the equivalent or better outside of the single market, whereas in fact it's nothing to do with tariffs. It's more to do with regulation, and you say that regulation causes a problem and that we want to get rid of the bureaucracy of the EU. But in fact, the bureaucracy and regulations will only go up when we leave the EU, because the whole point of being in the single market is it means you can trade with other countries in the EU as if you were trading like to your neighbour within the UK. The same, Matthew, even if our laws are different.
I understand that, Matthew, but what about the 80% of British businesses who have never traded overseas and never will? Why should they be bound by a set of rules designed for international trade? Surely that is nuts.
You got to remember the fact that we will regulate anyway. This idea that post-Brexit these businesses will no longer be bound by regulation is a farce. Because we will make laws. Most laws are for consumer protection anyway. It would be a bad thing if after Brexit we suddenly just didn't have laws for what goes in our food, what goes in.
I'm not proposing a complete laissez-faire.